When a parent chooses to be their kid's best champion, that parent is exercising their right, their freedom, and as far as I'm concerned, their constitutionally guaranteed capability to know what's best for their kids. Please, don't shy away from being your kid's best champion, because if you do, your child becomes at risk. Hi, I'm Dr. Scott Jensen, and welcome back to the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. We had a brief hiatus, and we're going to be routinely putting out podcasts, and we're going to focus on 5 issues. These are not political issues per se. These are philosophy issues. These are the things that make up kitchen table conversations. These are the substance of life. 5 topics that you'll see come up over and over again. We'll be talking about safety. We're talking about accountable government. We'll talk about freedom in the many dimensions that we have to talk about. And we'll talk about education, and that means multiple levels. And we'll talk about tyranny. Today I want to talk about parental rights, parental freedom. And I want to start out with the comment from George Orwell when he said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act." I want to unpack that. 3 years ago, I published my second book, and in it, I made a comment about pulling back the curtain regarding medical charges. But I would apply that same phrase, pulling back the curtain, to parental rights. How can we pull back the curtain so that there really is total transparency in terms of the authority, the freedom, and, if you will, the God-given right of parents to be in charge of their children? This is what we're talking about today, parental rights. You might wonder, what's my credentials regarding discussing parental rights and parental freedom? I would say this. I have 3 children. All 3 of them were educated in public schools through high school. All 3 of the kids went to college. In those college careers, there was a mix of private colleges and public universities. But far and away, the majority of our kids' education took place in public universities. Just as my wife pursued a public university setting for her veterinary degree, and I pursued a public university for my medical degree. So let's talk about that. We'll talk about, if you will, parents have an awful lot to do with where their kids go to school. Second thing I want to talk about in terms of my background is I spent 10 years serving on the school board in a smaller town, 15,000 in suburban Twin Cities area in Minnesota. I taught at the medical school for decades, sometimes in didactic lectures, often in the setting and the role of a preceptor, working hand in hand with medical students and residents in terms of, if you will, in the trenches, hands-on healthcare. I served in the Minnesota Senate, and I was on the Higher Education Committee, and I was also vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee. I saw the interface between parents and the system, if you will. During COVID-19, I was pulled into the conversation frequently regarding what was happening to parents as they expressed their concerns about what was happening to their children in the wake of COVID-19 policies. So let's go back and start with me as a parent. Well, for me as a parent, I'm just astonished that we're even having this conversation whereby parents are at times being called by government agents terrorists for attending a school board meeting. When I was a parent with grade school and high school children, it was just a given. If I wanted to know what my kids were being taught, all I had to do was ask. I wasn't going to be given any song and dance where I had to wait for months or fork over potentially hundreds or thousands of dollars to find out what my kids are being taught. I just asked. And if I needed to, I could call the teacher, and the teacher would respond, and we'd have a conversation. That really didn't happen very often. We had parent-teacher conferences, and that was helpful. Frequently, my wife took the lead on that because Mary seemed to know on a day-to-day basis so much more in the weeds kind of things than I did. And that was very comfortable. It might not have been comfortable if Mary and I hadn't been comfortable, but because we felt that our kids were in a good place, we just took it for granted. Shame on us. So then I served on the school board for 10 years. I was chair of the school board for 3 of those years. One of the most important things I learned on the school board was I was working with a superintendent, and I called him and said, I'd like to learn and understand more about this topic. And he said, Scott, I appreciate your interest in that. I will send you some things, but I want you to know I'm also going to send it out to all of the school board members so that they have the same opportunity to get up to speed on this issue. And I said, well, I don't know if they're going to be interested. And he said, that's not your decision. That's mine. He said, I'm not interested in having 1 out of 7 school board members necessarily be expert at something that the other school board members never thought to be expert at or didn't have the chance to become, if you will, an expert. That was really important, and I've used that in my life of leadership since then. When you're working with a group of people, it's important to create a level playing field. And in this situation I'm describing, the superintendent was saying, I want all 7 of you to have this same basis from which you can get smarter on this issue. That was my school board experience. And when I was on the school board, I remember we created some changes in the structure of our meetings. One of the things I wanted every quarter, every 3 months, I wanted to make sure that we heard from the teachers, was the school board and the school administration being as supportive as they could be to allow teachers to, if you will, create the learning environment they wanted in their class. Now, you got to remember, when I was on the school board, we didn't have cell phones in kids' hands. Huge difference. I mean, that's a game changer. But nevertheless, we wanted to hear from teachers. We always had an open portion of our meeting where parents could speak up. There were times where that was very uncomfortable. I remember one meeting I was chairing where literally we had hundreds of parents show up, and they weren't happy with the school board, and they weren't happy with me. If I remember right, the topic of contention at that time was extracurricular activities and how the school board interfaces with those activities. For me, it was a frustrating time because I thought we should spend more focus on what are our kids learning. But at that point in time, parents rose up and said, we're going to talk about extracurricular activities. So we did. Then I taught at the University of Minnesota, and I saw all kinds of attitudes regarding preceptors, where a preceptor, physician, attending physician goes in with a resident doctor to take care of a patient. That kind of situation lends itself to going in different directions. If the preceptor is too controlling and too much of a takeover kind of person, it marginalizes the input and the opportunity of the resident physician. So I had a chance to learn, how do we do these things? I also had a chance to learn that sometimes a resident physician was absolutely there and prepared and capable of taking outstanding care of this patient for this given problem, while other times they might not be. But in between were the tough ones, where they weren't really that capable, but they thought they were. That's where it gets difficult. And that's a little bit where we're at today, is that in-between situation where people act like they have the expertise to know everything about a matter when they really don't. But for some reason or another, they're delusional enough that they're convinced that they're the expert. This is how we arrive at our crisis today. We have parents who are doing nothing more than expressing their constitutionally granted rights and, in many situations, state constitutional rights in terms of wanting to know what's happening with my child's education. I'm paying for it. I'm taxed for it. This is my child, and I want to know. They're coming up against, in many situations, a school board that for some reason or another is convinced that they know best and that if they don't know best, the superintendent will take care of it. This is a problem. What kinds of problems has this created? Well, let's just tick off a few. First, as I mentioned, we've got members of the Attorney General's office calling parents attending school board meetings terrorists. We've got school districts telling parents that yes, they can look at the curriculum, but it'll be several months and they'll have to pay for a copy or for some transmission of information, and it's potentially going to be thousands and thousands of dollars. We have parents who are being censored in school board meetings if they happen to choose the wrong word. So word policing and thought policing has become more and more an important part of that conversation between parents and teachers and parents and administration and parents and school board members. Now that's really the dicey one, is that relationship between parents and school board members. Because most parents recognize that the school district administration has a job and they're talented and assertive. And they're the ones who hire the teachers. And the teachers are professionals, have a job, and want to be able to teach as they were trained to and as they have found works best. But parents generally look at the school board differently. They look at the school board as their side of the story. They look at the school board members as, we elected you. You knocked on my door. You wanted my support. You told me that you would stand for me, that you would stand against intrusive, indecent policies. And now that I want to talk to you, you're pushing me away. You're not answering my phone calls. Why? Because they're uncomfortable. So when I talk about parental rights, many times parents will ask me, what should I do? You have to focus on the school board. You don't get to control how the superintendent behaves. You can submit a complaint. You don't get to control how the teacher in your child's classroom elects to do this, this, or this. But you can make suggestions, and straight up with the teacher involved is the best way to do it if possible. But otherwise, you can go to the school board. You can also submit concerns and complaints, generally to the administrative team. But at the end of the day, parents have got to know that it's the school board that has their back. Now, when I say have their back, I think back to my kids. My kids knew their dad had their back, but they also knew that having their back didn't mean that I would agree with them, didn't mean that I would act in a way that would make them comfortable, didn't mean that at all. And the same thing with the school board. When the school board has your back, that doesn't mean they're going to instantaneously do what you want them to do. It means they need to listen to you. They need to respectfully consider what you're saying. And you have to do the same. It's a two-way street. We've seen parental rights and parental freedoms be absolutely decimated over the last 10, 20 years. But the last 3.5 years have been crippling for so many parents. Let's talk about that specifically. This isn't a COVID podcast. This is what happened to parents. How did their role get so diminished? How has it come to pass that parents feel like they've been marginalized? How do we even entertain the notion that somehow our children can become wards of the state? These are critical issues. When I think back to the last 3.5 years, I think of locking kids out of schools. We're fortunate that across this planet, we had places that didn't just go along to get along. We had a country like Sweden who elected to go differently than many other countries. And what we found was kids that were not locked out of schools continued their education at an expected pace and did not encounter increased burden of COVID disease. This was a critical awareness point. Even today, it's being argued and discussed. But most sensible people on either side of the conventional narratives will acknowledge that Sweden and their policies and their outcomes did not support the policies that so often were put in place in the United States. Another one, other than locking kids out of schools, was, if you will, what happened to physical and sexual abuse of our children. Because this is an area where we really expect parents to be in charge and to be absolutely that champion of their children's life experience and education. Now, granted, if the sexual and physical abuse is occurring by the parents, then that makes things very, very difficult, and it always does. But in many situations, that physical and sexual abuse is not by parents. It's by caretakers, caregivers, all kinds of people that might interface with a child's life. What we saw happen during the COVID pandemic was that ability to report early or to sense that something was terribly wrong in a child's life. That was undermined. That was undermined because of the policies put in place. And then the policy of masking. There have been numerous brief videos on multiple social media platforms whereby parents desperately call out the damage and the concern that parents are seeing regarding their children and masking. Personally, and in my medical practice, I saw this a lot. I saw where kids that were in those developmental stages of learning language, especially the 1 to 3-year-old kids, but even the 6 to 12-month-old kids, when they were encountering masks that frequently would hide the nonverbal cues of frowns or smiles, but especially when those masks would prevent the connection audio with video in regards to how to make sounds. How do we put our tongue in the roof of our mouth to make one sound? And how do we use our lips to make another sound? How do we sound out consonants? How do we express vowel sounds? These things were powerful. We're seeing the consequences now. We're seeing increased speech delays, certainly in the younger population. But in the older population, we're seeing the outcomes of the lockouts, where the kids are locked out of schools. Oftentimes it's loss of social skills, frequently anxiety, depression syndromes. And then I'd want to talk about suicide. This is an area where parents feel like they've been dislocated from the process of caring for their kids. It's hard to be a parent, and it's hard to be a kid. But oftentimes it's really challenging for that conversation between parent and child to take place regarding the dark spaces in our lives. You can quibble about whether or not suicide rates are up or not. I would say they are. And I would say they're underdiagnosed or undercounted because frequently the cause of death is uncertain in the adolescent population. But I think it goes without saying that we're seeing more consideration of suicide than ever before. Well-controlled studies have demonstrated that up to 25% of teenage kids consider whether or not suicide shouldn't be a legitimate option for them in terms of how they want to lay out their future. That's a problem. Think of that. 1 in 4 teenagers wondering if they should terminate their own lives. Parents are understandably incredibly frustrated by this. They see this phenomenon as evolving directly from their loss of authority and control over their children's lives. And the reason they see that is because parental rights have been undercut and in many situations decimated. Parents have been denied control over their kids. Now, I've talked about education in terms of school board and parental teacher meetings and school boards and administrations. But what about healthcare? What about when parents don't get or aren't allowed or aren't required to be involved with major decisions regarding their kids' health? This is astonishing. I raised my children with the clear notion that until my kids were 18, I would be involved in every aspect of their lives that I wanted to be involved with. Now, I understand that every is a pretty all-inclusive word, so maybe there are going to be that rare exception where parents don't necessarily enjoy or necessarily should enjoy total access to their children's lives. But for the most part, I can't imagine the process of parenting kids without having that veto power as to whether or not my child's going to be on this medication, whether or not my child is going to undergo this surgical procedure, whether or not my child is going to be entered into speech development class, whether or not my child is going to be getting an individualized education plan for some identified concern, which from the parent's perspective may or may not be legitimate. All of these things are what's going on in the parents' world of trying to raise their children. We talk about parental rights, but what we're really talking about is parental freedom to enjoy and exercise the rights of parents that has been in place for literally hundreds of years. If you think that what I'm saying really isn't a reality, that it's just empty words, take a look at this video.
I know there are many educators who want to protect children. This goal is not different from my own. Our implementation preferences may differ, but we want the same thing: to get through COVID without harm. Unfortunately, politics leads us to believe there is only one solution: masks. Yet thousands of schools around the country have been open during the entire pandemic without masks, and no corresponding rise in serious illness. There were not child coffins lined up as some educators in this county suggested would be the case. In fact, things have been going pretty much as normal. Kids are getting sick despite wearing masks. We are forcing healthy children home for exposure despite them wearing masks. And we are segregating children by vaccination status and religious exemption status despite the wearing of masks. So I ask you, if masks work, why don't they? I'd now like to cover the facts. Not policy is determined by the White House, not CDC recommendations, which I remind you is still policy. Policy, I might add, that changes by the day without any basis in science at all. So here are the facts. They're available to any one of you. Over the course of the pandemic, 49,000 children have died of all causes. 331 of those were COVID-related. Yet we have turned kids' lives upside down at school for what is essentially a non-risk. Let's put that risk into context. Last year, fewer kids died of COVID-19 than of heart disease, cancerous tumors, suicide, homicide, and drownings. Have the schools stopped serving hamburgers and French fries? Have we put up tinfoil on the ceilings to block power lines? Do we even address the growing incidences of suicide during the pandemic? No, we play politics with kids' faces by placing restrictive fabric over their noses and mouths that the CDC itself has said don't do anything, and it's for their safety. This is asinine. This is blatant political theater, and it needs to end. Finally, regarding that end, I need to point something out that has been bothering me. On November 15th of last year, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. McDade for 10 minutes following the CRT town hall meeting. During that discussion, which was friendly and cordial, I asked what she, as superintendent, could do to get the kids out of masks. Dr. McDade told me that she would if she could, but that her hands were tied by then Governor Northam's executive order mandating face coverings. And if it weren't for that, things would be different. Well, tonight, things are different. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. McDade, tonight, what has changed? And what do you plan on doing now that your hands are untied? I'm asking all of you to step up the way other leaders who have and are ending COVID restrictions by the day. What will it take? You are on the losing side of history, and it's time to make that right before these children now.
Thank you. Do you see what just happened there? Mary Ann Jensen, a mom. Couldn't you feel it? Couldn't you just feel it coming out of her pores as she cried out, asking, "What are you doing? Do you realize what you're doing to my kids? Do you realize that you're not following the science regarding masks?" She made the comment to the effect, "You're on the wrong side of history here." And you know what? I agree with her. I think that we're going to look back and we're just going to shake our heads and say, what in the world were we thinking? This Marianne Jensen, a mom, a champion for her kids and millions of other kids that she's never met, matters. Her impassioned plea for wake up, you're on the wrong side of history, matters. Let's look at this video where we see a different parent concerned about not necessarily a formal adoption of a curriculum that's problematic. He's concerned about the insidious and poisonous invasion of what's being messaged to the kids, to the parents, and even more so, what bizarre mind control game is going on, whereby, from this gentleman's perspective, the words of Martin Luther King are being absolutely kicked under the bus, and kids are being judged not by the content of their character, but by other superficial, phenotypic realities. And when I say phenotype, I'm talking about the physical appearance as to what color our skin is and things like that. Please watch this video.
When you talk about critical race theory, which is pretty much going to be teaching kids how to hate each other, how to dislike each other, that's pretty much what it's going to, that's pretty much, I don't care what you say, it's pretty much what it's going to all come down to. You're going to deliberately teach kids, this white kid right here got it better than you because he white? You're going to purposely tell a white kid, oh, the black people are all down and suppressed. How do I have 2 medical degrees if I'm sitting here oppressed? How did I get, first of all, time up, because I only got 5 minutes now, 5 minutes. 2 medical degrees. No mom, no dad in the house. Worked my way through college. Sat there and hustled my butt off to get through college. You gonna tell me somebody that looked like all y'all white folks kept me from doing that? Are you serious? What's sickening about this whole thing is what y'all doing right now is already something I do in my community right now to speak out against stuff, because black folks are getting told by other black folks, oh, you know you ain't gonna be able to do nothing out there in the world because them white folks ain't gonna let you get no, oh, you know you're not gonna be able to do it here because you know, the white man gonna keep you down. Well, how did I get where I am right now if some white man kept me down? How am I now directing over folks that look just like you guys in this room right now? How? What kept me down? What oppressed me? I worked for myself from off the streets to where I am right now. You gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory? Of this the reason why black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me? This is what we come to now. I can't believe we even talking about this right now. The last thing I'm gonna say right here is something that's crazy. Martin Luther King said he wanted his kids to grow up in a world where they are judged by the contents of their what? Their character, not their skin. If they letting this stuff go on right now, it is absolutely doing the complete reverse of what he's doing. So when February comes, don't talk about Martin Luther King. When February comes, don't talk about Black History Month. If y'all gonna sit there and just pretty much pee on his grave with this nonsense, that's exactly what's about to happen. When it all comes down to it, the person that's gonna be suffering from this, the one's gonna be hurt from this, is the kids. 10 years from now, if this stuff goes on, whose fault is it gonna be? Whose fault is it going to be? Who we going to look back on and blame for this? Because this is stuff we talking about right now. This stuff is going on right now. I do this stuff on a daily basis. I'm in the hood. I'm in the communities. I'm out there with folks in their face. I've been doing this stuff since I was 18 years old, talking to black folks. And you know what? None of them are buying this nonsense. None of them are. But if you want to implement this into the school system, I guarantee you to the day that I die, I'm going to be the very person right there debunking stuff, tearing stuff down, letting them know they can do exactly what I did and get exactly where I am by putting themselves to work and getting there. And ain't not one white person ever going to keep any of them from getting there. So the CRT stuff, BS.
That's a pretty compelling video. Why is this gentleman so motivated by critical race theory? Well, this is a black man speaking. He, probably more than most, is being judged, and frequently judged not by what he says, but by what he doesn't say, because people are pigeonholing him into thinking that he shouldn't be saying that. He should be saying this. And he's saying he'll have none of it. That's what makes his words so powerful. I'm not interested in having a lengthy discussion about buzzwords like critical race theory, but I would like us to step back and just ask ourselves, what does that phrase mean? And I think we'll get as many definitions as we have people defining it. But I wonder if there couldn't be some commonality to what we think that would capture the notion that critical race theory is first and foremost a theory. Secondly, it's about race. And thirdly, it is presuming to know what is and isn't critical. When we look at it that way, we can see where we are marginalizing people, we are dividing people, we are fracturing people. We're telling people, in regards to critical race theory, you're a victim, you're an oppressor. And in many situations, we're talking to 5-year-olds. In some situations, we're talking to 10-year-olds. In many situations, we might be talking to teenagers. But the bottom line is, we're dividing, we're fracturing. And when we do that, at some level, we destroy hope. And to me, that's probably the worst thing about what's going on in our schools with critical race theory. When this divisive issue is allowed to decimate hope, it has a direct corollary with how much dreaming our kids do about what their future lives could look like. I remember being a kid, and I remember my kids being kids. And I'll tell you what, to be able to dream of being a fireman or superwoman or a teacher or a nurse, a truck operator or a doctor, a lawyer or a parent. Kids dreaming dreams liberates the mind, expands the mind, and allows kids to become all that they might be destined to become. That's what's so disabling of our kids' dreams. And I would feel remiss if I didn't comment on one other powerful anti-dream kind of impact on our kids' lives. What might pose challenges for kids to dream about the lives they want? Hypersexualization. In other words, introducing sexual topics at inappropriate age levels. Honestly, 5-year-olds can look at their genitals as nothing more than excretory organs for a urine and stool, and that's very reasonable. Potty training is a big deal, and then maintaining control even when the kids are excited and don't want to take time out to use the bathroom. That's a big deal, and we can leave it right there. But the notion that in kindergarten or in elementary school, our kids should be challenged with, what kind of a pronoun do you want used to describe you? Or that the kids might be introduced in terms of what's going on in their parents' bedroom. These things, in my mind, are way out of bounds. And I think the great majority of people believe that as well. This makes no sense at all. We can have discussions. We can have discussions and should have discussions. But to me, I just can't get my arms around how it is that K through third graders can possibly be exposed to what we're doing. Now, having said all that, I think we have to get back to the basic point that I make so often in my conversations with people. Who is the best champion for whatever cause we're dealing with? When it comes to patient care, I'm convinced the best champion of one's health is that person. It is not the physician or the provider. It is the patient. In the same way, a 5-year-old kid isn't equipped to have the wisdom or the wherewithal to champion his or her education and future, nor is a 10-year-old. If you look at developmental studies in terms of cognitive capabilities, at the age of 12 or 13, kids move from a concrete, sequential kind of place to more of an ability to abstractly think. If you ask a 10-year-old, what does it mean if someone says, if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones? The 10-year-old will give you a different response than the 15-year-old. We need to recognize that. Without question, to the age of 15 or 16, parents have got to be virtually the total champion of their children's lives, education, health, well-being, and growing up. At 16, there's no question. We've now seen kids move long ways through puberty. They're driving. They have the ability to abstractly think. They don't necessarily agree with their parents' positions, whether you're talking about societal positions or political positions or educational goals. But I think we can say without question, parents have the right and should enjoy the freedom to be their kids' best champions in virtually every aspect of life, at least until 16. And then for the next couple of teenage years, most parents, most 16 and 17-year-olds will have the occasional bump up, the occasional grind, and that's natural. It's natural as the day is long. But I want to leave you with one thought. When a parent chooses to be their kid's best champion, that parent is exercising their right, their freedom, and as far as I'm concerned, their constitutionally guaranteed capability to know what's best for their kids. Yes, there will be the occasional exception, but we need to reinforce and come alongside parents of all station, color, or circumstance and plead with you. Please, don't shy away from being your kid's best champion. Because if you do, your child becomes at risk. Thanks for joining me. If you want to go to my website, it's drscottjensen.com. In that website, you'll be able to see thoughts that I have about different things, and you can get updates on my lawsuits against the Minnesota Attorney General and the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. If you want to purchase the book that I mentioned, We've Been Played, and I quoted it a couple of times, you can get that on drscottjensenbook.com, drscottjensenbook.com. We're going to talk more in the future about freedom, but I think it's appropriate to start with one of the most critical aspects of American life, and that's the rights and the freedom of parents to be their kids' best champion. Thank you.